Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the program. I am your host, Chris George Zuger, and you have entered the Den of Lore. Pull your chair up to the fire, grab your glass of scotch or pretty well anything you have that's alcoholic. It is Friday night. We are sitting down with one of the world's greatest comparative cosmologists, if not the greatest comparative cosmologist alive today, the great Laird Scranton, who has been so kind to provide his presence and grace us, and me, and you, with his. And we're going to be discussing a book that I wish I'd had the wherewithal of energy and just overall observational ability to bring him on here when it came out. Unfortunately, as some of you know, I've been a little busy. But thankfully, it being summertime, we were able to correct that. And I'm glad I can share with all of you. Now, it's a big weekend. My daughter's 6 months old. We have new patrons who have joined, and things are just getting into summer mode. And I gotta say, it makes me feel real privileged to be doing this show for all of you. And I just have to make sure I get this in here. There you go. So it looks like it's its own studio, and I just have a curtain back here. And, you know, even with all the summer hubbub and us moving to Thursdays next week, it still allows me to be able to provide some comfort to all of you on the direction that the show is going. We are expanding the graphics, improving things, as you can see, making them seem a little more futuristic, a little more future, if you would. Although the theme of ancient knowledge today... Sorry, it's my... Hi. Good night. And that was...
That was the future.
That was the future.
Futuristic. That was the future.
That was the future. I'm just going to turn the music off. I can't even. There we go. I don't know how to follow that. Well, okay, so thank you all for joining on the program. I suck at intros. I'm always like trying to watch like 4 different monitors, and the reason I have these monitors and have the ability to watch them every single day is you guys, listeners and the patrons, who ensure that I can do this show every single week. Literally, the show would not exist without you. I don't know how I would operate if we did not have the constant ability to improve and refine the show for all of you to enjoy. And it keeps us ad-free so that you can enjoy this with only our washroom break and no sponsors, no corporate sponsors telling us what to do and what we can say and what subjects are controversial in terms of history or in UFOs. 100% listener supported so that it's for you, and we support the community as well. And I'm 100% accountable to you guys. So if you don't like something or you want to see more of something, you give me a suggestion, you send me an email, and I got to answer because you guys are the sponsors. So go to patreon.com /Den of Lore, and the link is in the video, and support us for as little as $1 a month. And I got to give a special shout out to Jackie from across the pond, Pat from Brooklyn, Kevin, Jenny, Dobromir, Lee, Chuck Schwartz, Jared, Mrs. Fox, Joshua, Wayne, and our den mother Ellen. And those are our illustrious masters and our masters. That tier starts at $9 and goes up to $99 a month. Our fellow crafts are at $5 a month, and that's for Audrey, Eclipse, Eric, Photopic, Nick, Corey, Venice, and Charles, as well as Hobby, courtesy of denoflore.com's PayPal button, and our entered apprentices, Mark, Mike, and Martin. And for our patrons, Katie, Christopher M., and Robin. And I do know that we do have one more patron that did recently join, and I know that my first set of questions for Laird are actually in my Patreon inbox. So I need to make very certain that I get both of these taken care of post-haste. In the meantime, I'm going to bring Laird on air. Laird, how you doing? You're looking fantastic.
Oh, thanks. I'm doing great. Life is pretty good. Been sort of chasing our tail the last couple of weeks, though. We've been traveling and just back home, trying to get back settled down. We've had a number of personal sorts of things to attend to. A new car, an old car died, new car acquired, numerous other things. So, the stuff of life.
I've been there before, trust me. New cars are always fun. I do see you got a nice red one.
Yes. Well, yes, and of course the color is the most important part. So
Oh well, of course, and there's your
red
wonderful.
red are the most highly rated, I hear.
Well, it was very surprising that you weren't the one in the front seat for that one.
Well, actually, we're pretty happy with what we ended up with. We were driving a 15-year-old Ford Taurus station wagon, the quintessential mom car.
Well, when you're raising kids and you need a lot of storage space.
Transport space to and from college.
Exactly.
You're a few years away from that. You have a couple of years before that happens.
I'm going to take as much. Oh my goodness! I'm hoping that it is a couple of years away. The costs for by then are going to be insane, and I'm like, just how many? It's like, Meg, how many kids do you want? Just one? Okay, all right. I think I can work with that. And a special thanks to Lynn, who is our new patron. Literally just joined for the intro show because we were talking about last week's episode and comparing it to your work because there is some overlap, and we're going to compare and contrast and compare notes after class, as it were.
Okay.
So I have to ask you. I know that you had mentioned the last time when your book, which was released independently and available still on Amazon.com, it's in paperback as well as in Kindle, I believe, or is it just in paperback still?
The Seeking the Primordial
Yes.
book is just in paperback. The create space options to produce the book don't lend themselves to Kindle.
Really?
Even the sample, they automatically forward a sample that supposedly is Kindle ready, and couldn't get it format right for Kindle in any format.
Oh, that's unfortunate. But if you got a paperback copy, and I think I actually flipped the. Well, I have to fix something just very quickly. When I had seen the book, and I think it was Joshua who had received his copy. It's something a lot more personal when you actually have an author that you know and you've listened to every single interview of him, and you actually receive that physical copy of it. And there's something to be said when it comes to Kindle and that convenience, but the physical, that tried and true, hold it in your hands, is always just makes you feel warm and tingly.
Well, we're neo-Amish. If we can't tap it into a clay tablet, it doesn't count.
So you have to get eggs.
Yeah.
If it's in stone, you'll never forget it because it lasts forever. The new book on the Maori, or is it
Maori?
Maori, and I've been pronouncing it correctly all week, and all of a sudden, like, keep it together, Chris. You have been talking about this for some time, and you had first approached the subject summer of last year when I managed to get some information dragged out of you, which hadn't been to air yet, and I have to say was one of my favorite shows of all time. And you had hinted at it, and I'm like, okay, well, how who hasn't picked this book up? Or is it going to be released in 2018? And we're actually here talking about it. And I didn't have a chance to review last year's notes on it. So give us a brief rundown on the overall arching premise and how did you approach even the premise itself?
You're talking about the Maori book,
Yeah,
right?
the Maori book, yes.
But the Maori book actually began. It started to be my second book. I became aware when I was studying the Dogon very early on that the Maori have a concept of an atom referred to as the Po. That's a very close match to the Dogon concept.
Mm-hmm.
And it's presented in the context of a esoteric tradition whose presentation within the Maori culture is very similar to the Dogon. So I could tell up front that I had two traditions that somehow were connected, even though it didn't seem like they should be. And my intention was to write the Maori book as a second book. But that manuscript kept getting bumped by other material that seemed to be more urgent, more pressing, and that seemed to follow more logically in a path of research. And so the Maori book just kept getting shuffled off and shuffled off. Now, as it turns out, I feel fortunate that happened because, as it turns out, the Maori tradition ties to every culture and every era that I've written about. And if I had written about it early in my process, I wouldn't have realized that. I wouldn't have seen those connections.
Now, I know that it is in Polynesia, or is it more in Oceania? Or it's New
The
Zealand?
Maori are a Polynesian culture,
Okay.
um, but Polynesia is all around that area of the Pacific, and the Maori are about as far um, um, west as that extends.
Now, this is coming from Jackie from across the pond, one of our illustrious masters, and she's the person who keeps me honest. And whenever she sends me in a question, I always make sure that I can get in there because she cannot usually listen live. And if she does, I want to make sure they're out of the way because it's goodness knows what time in the morning there. So, Jackie, this one's for you. Hope everything's going so well. Well, and I hope everything's going well for you too, Jackie. Did I miss this one? I did miss this one. Load earlier message. Oh. And scroll down. Okay, so Patreon stacks everything up like Facebook messages, but you've got several different ones. So even if I click on the latest one, it starts me back at the top of the chain. Bad UX guys, come on. I'm really looking.
Software can't live it with it, can't shoot it.
Oh my goodness. I hope you are all well. I'm really looking forward to your show with Laird Scranton. Sadly, I will not be able to see it live. However, I will watch it tomorrow. I know it's not a masterclass, but would it be possible to ask Laird 2 questions? And again, anybody can ask any questions, whether it's masterclass or not. If you have a question, we'll make sure that his contact information that is available through his website is on the website as well, so you can send him an email to catch up. And if you have any questions for his next show with us, just send them to me. I know, does the number 8 have any significance in Maori tradition? And this is the second part. Can the word parents in Maori creation tradition be linked to androgynous in the Dogon tradition?
First of all, the number 8 is significant across the cultures that I study, including the Maori, and it expresses itself in a number of different ways, but it always pertains to the same symbolism, ultimately. The numbers 7 and 8, from the Dogon perspective, what we're talking about are stages of formation of a primary component of matter called, the Dogon refer to it as the po pilu. This is the Calabi-Yau space of string theory. And it expresses itself in 8 physical stages and 1 conceptual one. That's why it's sometimes, 7 physical stages and 1 conceptual one, which is why it's sometimes expressed as 7, sometimes as 8. The 8th stage is essentially the bursting of a bubble that also initiates the formation of the next bubble.
Okay.
So it's a shared stage between 2 structures. As far as whether the concept of parents for the Maori connect to androgyny for the Dogon, it does in an odd way. What we see in this creation tradition are symbolic reversals that happen about midway through the tradition. If we're talking a 12,000 year span of time, about 6,000 years or somewhere after that, we start seeing cross-culturally reversals in symbolism. Now, the Dogon are dedicated to preserving original forms. And so even though the influences that are causing these reversals in symbolism dictate that they now have to reverse certain things, they effectively roll their eyes when they do it. One of the things that reverses is masculine and feminine. And so when you ask the Dogon about their tribal god, because of reversals in symbolism, they have to represent a deity who was originally considered to be feminine as being masculine. And so they sort of hedge. They say, well, in truth, Amma, our creator god, is actually both male and female. And that's where the concept of androgyny comes from. By the time you get to the Maori tradition, which is much later tradition, patriarchy has supplanted matriarchy pretty effectively. And so you have things overtly represented as being masculine that in other traditions might be feminine. But you have very odd things also crop up because of that. You have deities who are supposedly male, according to the representation of the Maori, but there's an old myth that explains how the male god was presented as a bride to another deity.
This sounds very similar. Last week we had Colin Hayter, who is from Australia, and he's one of the individuals who has a lot of claims and information regarding the cosmology of the Gosford glyphs that are found just outside of Sydney. And
Right.
one interesting fact that he had brought up was that a Khufu was actually a woman and not a man. And the standard line of thinking, and obviously that's something we don't necessarily subscribe to 100% here on the show, is it's interesting because it's not the first time I've actually heard that. And it's not the first time I've actually read it. Is that something that is also considered when looking at Maori tradition, not just from a cosmological standpoint, but like even history and symbolism? Like, is everything potentially flipped? And does that relate to the idea of esoteric and exoteric as a dichotomy?
Where it comes out of, these reversals in symbolism, the way you can think of it and have it make sense to you is, an example I use is, imagine a group of people on a cross-country flight, flying from New York City to Los Angeles, let's say, or
I take two gravel and I pass out. I don't worry about that.
well, chances are, if you're on that plane, you don't talk to very many people. You probably don't know anybody else on the flight. And yet, by the time you get to your destination, everybody on the flight has switched their watch by 3 hours.
Mm-hmm.
Now, this hasn't happened because of communication between the people on the flight. It happens because they understand how time zones work, and they realize that when they get to the West Coast, the time zone is different, and so they change their representation of time. The same thing is true with symbolism, that there are eras, prescribed eras to the symbolism. And so as time progresses and we pass certain markers in these eras, each culture knows, because of their own training, that certain symbolism needs to be reversed. It no longer applies the way that it previously did. Best way to explain that is, in the archaic formulation, we're talking about pairs of universes, one that is less material and one is more material.
Oh, I remember that.
The dynamic of energy between the universes works sort of like an hourglass, sand in an hourglass. Now, if you start out, you take a fresh hourglass, turn it over so all the sand's on top, draining to the bottom. Initially, the upper globe is has the more sand, and the lower globe has the less sand. But once you pass the midpoint of the process, those roles reverse. The lower globe now suddenly has the more sand, and the top globe has the less sand. This is what happens with non-materiality and materiality. Scrolling energies cause the one that was previously less material to become more material, and then vice versa. There's a dynamic, a cyclical dynamic going on. And so if the symbol for a non-material universe or a less material universe is a circle, and the symbol of a square is a symbol for a more material universe, then in archaic times, our universe, which at that time was less material, would be symbolized by a circle. Halfway through the process, it suddenly becomes symbolized by a square. This is one of the ways we know that the Egyptian pyramids were built in the second half of one of these cycles. They have squared bases that represent the earth. When we compare a Dogon shrine, it has a circular base. A stupa, a Buddhist stupa shrine, which is the same form, has a squared base. We know simply from the form that one is archaic and the other one's more recent.
Now, if we're looking at that type of symbolism, are we expecting the differences between the Dogon and the Maori to be very similar, or was that the main purpose of the investigation, to see what similarities were there? And if so, what were kind of the main interesting, I'm going to say like sticking points, but like even just stuff you didn't necessarily expect that cropped up?
Well, in my initial comparisons, I didn't understand how the differing eras of these two cultures would affect how things present. The Dogon tradition represents things as they were in ancient Egypt around 3000 BC, but the cosmology that is being preserved is much older than that. It might date back to 10,000 BC. The Maori didn't even arrive in New Zealand by traditional viewpoints until around 1180. So there are thousands and thousands of years that of time that had passed between the tradition as it appears in the Dogon hands and as it appears in the Maori hands. So I had my own questions about how much of an overlap I was going to see, because I know how the game of telephone works, and most cultures are not in a position to be on top of that to prevent the effects of the game of telephone from affecting their symbolism. As it turns out, language is one of the keys. If you start with a Maori comparative dictionary, it's a Maori Polynesian comparative dictionary written by Edward Tregear. So that he's giving us definitions of Maori words, but the same concepts apply throughout Polynesia pretty much. And so Tregear also gives us nuances of meanings from other Polynesian tribes. And so when you look at that dictionary, you discover quite a bit of overlap with all of these eras that I've studied that are more ancient. Better yet, the original cosmology was phonetic in value. Right? It was an oral tradition. So symbolism that we would expect to occur in Egypt between a written glyph and a meaning. In the Dogon situation, the concept relates to a phonetic value, not to a symbol necessarily. So syllables, there are root syllables that carry meanings. Now the Maori language is based on those same root syllables. And so when I look at a Maori word, even though they take more complicated forms than the Dogon words do, it's like mixing and matching these syllables to produce more complicated concepts. And so very often I can predict the meaning of a Maori word, having no knowledge of it ahead of time, simply based on what the phonetics are.
Okay, and how, if the phonetics have meaning, is that because it's just a way to be able to encode the information, or are they expecting some type of effect out of it? Like, would it be considered and I know this may be to some of our more non-woo listeners, it may sound woo, or to some of our more esoteric and occult listeners, this may just be up your alley. Are they words of power?
Well, cosmology and the occult are two sides of a coin. In Maori culture, anyone who studies cosmology is precluded from studying the occult. This is true in other cultures like the Dogon also. And so very often when the traditions I'm working with are focused on the preservation of cosmological meanings. And so their orientation for the most part isn't towards the occult. And it's almost automatically not towards the occult. But there is a suggestion that there could be an occult side to all of this.
Well, this is also one aspect, and everyone take a shot on this one, an aspect of Freemasonry, which, as some of you know, I am a member of, Illuminati confirmed, and the concept of the Tetragrammaton, being the four-letter word that is supposed to symbolize the true word of God, or Yahweh, as it's termed in the Bible, it's that four-letter syllable, that four-letter construction of, well, that name, each one having its own particular pronunciation, hence the term, the Tetragrammaton, where you've got the four letters, each letter is its own sound, which then has a certain meaning to it. But obviously, if you understand anything regarding Hebrew, the way that it's normally written is, well, that isn't the way the Hebrews actually said it in the first place. So is this that type of comparison? Like, can this also be applied from, to the Maori language?
There is a side to Maori priesthood that is occult, and an initiate who studies the occult in Maori culture in traditional times, in ancient times, or older eras, in order to graduate, was required to use magic to kill a person. And the closer the relationship of the person to the initiate, the clearer a demonstration it was of the power of the initiate. That aspect of the cosmology is not a typical aspect of any of the traditions I study, but it absolutely is there among the Maori. And to the extent that language or words of power are the way of affecting that, I can't say that that's not true. I know that from my own perspective, there's a sense that it would undercut my research to shift the focus to the occult side of this stuff. So I haven't really explored it very deeply.
Okay. So if so staying away from the occult side, because obviously if it's a subject, it's always a cool subject to be able to discuss. But at the same time, if you're not very read up on it, and obviously if we're talking about, well, hey, this is, there's some aspects of it that may not necessarily be very easy to talk about, as you had mentioned. What about the symbolism itself? I've been noticing in the researches that I have done with regards to the symbolism is the intricate carvings that the Maori are very well known for. Some have been carried on, and that skill has been carried on even to today. But it is, as you said, possibly 1,000 years or just a little bit older if they have ventured from other islands onto the New Zealand islands. What in particular about the carvings that you've been able to find is consistent between, let's say, the Dogon, or let's say, Buddhists from Tibet, and even found in Skara Brae?
Well, there are practices that are common. One of the traditional icons of Ganesha in India takes the form of a sort of a formless rock that was painted with red paint. Usually these would appear, it should be in sometimes not even in obvious places, but in sites that were important in India that were religiously significant. You would find these rocks painted. The same is true in New Zealand, that red painted rocks have a bearing. Many of the most knowledgeable researchers that I've been working from in order to write my book were confused about the fact that they see comparability to the Tamil in India, which is a cultural group that dates to ancient times and to philosophies that are very ancient, but no overt expression of Hinduism. They can't find any evidence of any Hindu gods, and yet they'll find artifacts with Tamil writing on them. And that's confusing to the researchers. How can this be a tradition from India that passed down through India and have arrived in New Zealand with comparability to Hinduism and Buddhism in a lot of cases, but no overt reference to anything Buddhist or Hinduist?
And there is also the aspect of that there are certain proponents of the into Africa theory, which essentially relates their journey from that part of the world, or for just humans in general, from that part of the world into Asia and then on into Africa after having already emigrated out of there, which would have happened, tens of thousands of years ago. So, is it possible that using the oceans that they would have been able to travel backwards, how have you been able to track the development from culture to culture?
Let me explain what the lines of transmission, the primary lines of transmission I see from the perspective of Egypt and the Dogon, and that will help us explain what the situation is with the Maori. From what I see, the first expression of the cosmology is at Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, southeast Turkey. This is the region of the Fertile Crescent around 10,000 BC. It's the same region where we see the first evidence of cultivated seeds, of agriculture, of stonemasonry, of metallurgy, of domesticated animals. There are any number of civilizing skills that make their first appearance in the Fertile Crescent in that region. Now, we also see certain artifacts in Egypt that have symbolic connection to that same era, or seem to. If you accept that, Robert Bauval's idea that the three largest pyramids at Giza reflect the belt stars of Orion at 10,000 BC, or if we accept the idea that goes with that the Sphinx, the gaze of the Sphinx was towards the constellation of Leo in the era of 10,000 BC, then we're left with a problem, because we either have to assume that the alignments for those placements were made in the era of 10,000 BC, or else we have to somehow postulate that some later culture had the ability to retrospectively calculate what the alignment should have been. Now, I find it a lot more credible to think that at least the alignments were made at 10,000 BC. And that means we have what looks like a direct connection from the philosophy at Göbekli Tepe and the cosmological philosophy in Egypt at 10,000 BC. So the first line of transmission is a direct one at 10,000 BC to Egypt. The second line of transmission to Egypt passes down through India through a group called the Shakti Cult. This is a cult whose traditional icons represent all the same symbolic elements we see at Göbekli Tepe. Standing stones, stones placed in circles, stone cairns, animals represented in stone. Like the Sphinx, animals carved from natural outcroppings of rock is an icon of the Shakti cult. Now, the Shakti cult is understood to be foundational to the traditions in India, all of them, but seemingly they preceded them, and it serves as sort of a connecting piece to the Göbekli Tepe era. Now, those influences pass down through India, and from what I can see, into Egypt at Elephantine in the south at around 4000 BC. And you have sister goddesses there, let's see, Satet and Anuket, who are comparable to the Shakti sister goddesses. And you've got Hopi, who is a god of abundance, essentially, who has symbology similar to Ganesha. So that's a second line of influence. The third line of influence seems to make its way to northern Scotland around sometime after 4000 BC. Now, there are probably half a dozen different elements in northern Scotland that tie through DNA and other measures to the Fertile Crescent at around 6000 BC. And so we have item after item pointing to and almost screaming at us, look, the origin for the Scottish tradition, at least these symbolic elements, seems to have begun in the Fertile Crescent. We have Orkney sheep, a particular variety of sheep unique to the UK that have DNA that ties to the Fertile Crescent at 6000 BC. We have a form of barley that does the same thing. We have a form of vole or mouse on Orkney Island that's unique to the UK that testing hasn't been done, but I have every reason to think might also tie to that same region. We have a burial tradition on Orkney in the UK that has all of the same aspects as the Shakti cult burial tradition, but doesn't tie to any tradition in Scandinavia or in the UK or in Europe. So there's lots of reason to think we had a line of transmission that came at around 4000 BC, sometime between 6000 and 4000 BC, directly across from the Fertile Crescent region to Orkney. We can almost trace it by the locales of the vole or the mouse. Anthropologists understand that mice don't travel very far from where they live, and they migrate with humans. And so if you can follow the DNA of a mouse, you can, by association, follow the movements of groups of people. So this particular vole out of Turkey makes its way down the coastline into Palestine, and then jumps without any other connecting piece to the northern tip of Africa, and then seemingly jumps with no connecting piece to Orkney Island. You can almost trace a path by sea from the Palestine region to Orkney. Orkney, one of the key villages there, or Neolithic villages, is sitting on a place called the Bay of Scale. Now, Sakai, the word Sakai or Sakai, is a cosmological term that means to celebrate, and El is a deity of space who went hand in hand with Yah in the Hebrew tradition.
Huh.
So we have connections of that sort that also point to Palestine as one of the originating influences on what happens at Orkney. Now, then on Orkney, on Orkney itself, I see Orkney as having been an instructional sanctuary. We have the beginnings of the stone masonry tradition in the UK there. We we have progressive stages of matter carved in stone as stones, megalithic stone sites on Orkney that are a progression that lead to this village that sits on the Bay of Scale. It looks like an instructional sanctuary. I wrote a book called The Mystery of Skara Brae that suggests that this was an origin for dynastic Egypt. So now that line of influence that jumps Fertile Crescent to Orkney then jumps back to Egypt by around 3000 BC.
Obviously, this would bring to mind the question of how did they get there? Did they go through UFOs or some type of portal? Well, heck, yes, it's a possibility.
There's the easy answer to that question, that anybody who's talking in proper terms about how matter forms at 3000 BC, their biggest problem isn't how to get around.
Oh, there you go. I'm also like I always make this joke of whenever somebody brings this up, and it's the idea of fast travel. If anybody ever plays Skyrim or any Elder Scrolls open sandbox game, where like how the world is so large, how do you finish it so quickly? Like you fast travel, you start here, you jump to the other side of the map, and all you're doing is that loading zone is the hyperspace in between, as it were. So it's kind of the same equivalency to that for anybody out there who is trying to piece that together. I'm also very interested to know, and because this one's coming from Abraham in YouTube chat. Now, with regards to what you've mentioned from the line of timing and how these cultures seem to be connected in terms of their symbolism, wouldn't this support the theory that India did not precede ancient Egypt culture, taking into consideration that the Tamil culture was decoupled from Hinduism at one point?
Depends on which aspect of culture in India we're talking about. The root philosophy of the traditions I'm studying is a philosophy called Samkhya that is, again, foundational to all the traditions in India. But all of its elements are also found in the Dogon culture. And the Dogon culture, there's every reason to think the Dogon were Egyptian at 3000 BC. So it's pretty clear to me, simply because of the way the philosophy of the cosmology works, that cosmological philosophy from India had to have preceded dynastic Egypt.
Wow. And we're talking dynastic Egypt, so that's about 30. Well, depending on which chronology you want to go by, could be as early as 3600 BC, if I'm not mistaken. And then you've got your pre-dynastic, or at least Dynasty 0, which I think is like pseudo-dynastic Egypt at this point, because they've revised even that part. And you've got your pre-dynastic, which is between potential hunter-gatherers, but they've still found massive, just like battlefields that have had thousands of people fighting on it, or hundreds of people at least. Is as late as, as early as about 7,000 or 6,000 BC, I believe. So there is much to be.
There's a difficulty about some of the interpretations. On Orkney, they discovered what they were certain was evidence of warfare in later eras after 2600 BC on Orkney. And the evidence of it was mass burials of bones of bodies that have been dismembered and sometimes burned, with very commonly with axe wounds on the top of their skulls. Now, from an archaeologist standpoint, this is sure signs of warfare. What they're missing was that these are all aspects of a known burial tradition of the Shakti cult that didn't involve warfare at all. In the archaic, actually what we have is a reflection of symbolic reversal. In the archaic era, what the goal was when a person died was to help them to ascend through the top of their skull. And so tops of the skull were opened to allow that. That same tradition, when we reverse it for the later era, the goal is to allow the deceased person's soul to be reborn in the material world. And the way they do that is through the opening of the mouth. Material creation is spoken. Ascension happens as energy, Shakti energy, that passes through the top of the skull in India. Now, if you go to the Egyptian word that refers to the opening of the mouth ceremony, it's written with two glyphs. One glyph is a glyph that Budge says refers to the crown of the skull, and the other glyph is a mouth. So the very form of the word for the tradition embodies both halves of the symbolism. It reflects both halves of the symbolism. So when we say in Egypt they have evidence of mass warfare in archaic times, they might not, from my perspective. From my perspective, what they may be seeing is evidence of that same burial tradition, which should be an archaic tradition, should appear in pre-dynastic times as opposed to dynastic times.
Now, just changing tack or direction, at least for a moment. If knowing that the symbols can relate throughout history and be the same whether you've got slightly different pronunciations, but the overall meaning and the symbolism stays the same. Right. Did you watch Robert's show on Joe Rogan Experience yesterday?
No, I didn't see it. We've been chasing our tails, as I say, trying to catch up with ourselves since our trip.
Okay, this may actually be perfect then, because then you haven't actually seen it on the show, and you may be able to provide your perspective on this. The Kanga mask.
Yes. Now, the phonetics of the cosmology tell us what that means. Ka represents the concept of an embrace. You might be familiar with the Egyptian glyph that's two raised arms connected, forearms and arms. That's the phonetic value that goes with that is Ka. It represents the concept of an embrace. The same thing is represented by the arms on the Göbekli Tepe pillar.
Mm-hmm.
Na is the concept of the feminine. It's symbolic of the non-material. And Ga is representative of the concept of temporality, which associates with the material. So Ka Na Ga is an embrace between the feminine and the material.
Now, I believe this was mentioned by Dr. Schock, that the concept could possibly have arisen from an aspect of just general observations of a potential coronal mass ejection, which had, at least seems to, from the evidence, correspond also with the Younger Dryas comet impact theory. Because it was actually stated that, believe it or not, the one could have caused the other, which I think is just kind of really sucks for those guys. It's like, yeah, here's a 200-kilometer comet that's going to hit you with a 2-kilometer piece of it, and oh, by the way, yeah, here's this coronal mass ejection that'll slam into the planet as well shortly afterwards. It's a really bad week. So you think you got it bad, people? Nah, nothing on that. And this is what they had seen in the sky based on a massive coronal mass ejection dropping that much ionized material into the atmosphere at one time, and just it being dealt with in that way. And other aspects are anthropomorphic forms of birds or winged serpents, which seems to bring a lot of imagery, especially when you're relating it to the Dogon, the Egyptians, the Maori, the South Americans, the Hopi Indians on the western United States coast and into the interior. And it leads to that idea of, well, where is this coming from? Is this something that's natural made? Or, again, as you'd mentioned, is it because we are part of a dual nature universe that seems to have possible contact with one another?
Well, when you have a symbol like this that is so pervasive,
mm-hmm.
there are only three possibilities. One is that it's a shape that they all saw, the way Robert Schock believes, which is, I can't say that it isn't. That might be true, because the energetic dynamic that defines the universe is each of the energetic dynamics that define the processes of creation at a microcosmic scale play out in similar form all the way up the chain. So what's true at the level of the quantum world, or true at the level of atoms, is also true at the level of solar systems and galaxies. So this is an energetic shape according to the Dogon tradition, and as such, it certainly could be seen in some other form that has parallel import on whatever level you see it on. So that's one possibility, is they could all see the same shape. The second possibility, which is the one that's represented explicitly by the Dogon and the Buddhists, is that they all knew about it because they had all been instructed about it.
Hmm.
The third possibility is that both of those things are true. Buddhism says that according to the cycles of the Yuga, that there are eras in which humanity is more able to perceive things non-material than we are now. So it's quite possible that they had been instructed about it, knew about it, and were able to see it.
And then at that point, they've incorporated into their symbolism to signify something that's very significant to that particular culture and something that they wanted to at least communicate.
Now, one way we can distinguish is, for example, there are arguments that construction of pyramids represents parallel development.
Mm.
That any culture who thinks to build with stone will eventually decide, or will eventually think to stack those stones up in the shape of a pyramid. There are only so many things you can do with stones. So it's quite possible that two cultures built pyramids simply because that's what you do with stone. The problem is that there's also very complex symbolism that goes with that structure that we find from culture to culture to culture. It represents the womb of a woman lying on her back. The four faces of the pyramid are associated with star groups that regulate the agricultural cycle. This is symbolism of a complexity that a person who makes the choice to stack up a bunch of stones doesn't automatically think of. And the fact that the same symbolism appears in all these different cultures connected to that same form implies the influence of a system of thought, not simply a common impulse to build something.
And
so the way to distinguish with this Kanaga symbol ultimately would be to find out what does that shape symbolize for the culture that represents it. And if it symbolizes the very same thing that it symbolizes for the Dogon and for other cultures, then you can infer the influence of an instructed tradition, not just seeing a sign in the sky. Because seeing the shape will get them to draw it, it won't get them the complex symbolism.
And if you're looking at being able to draw it, it is how could this also relate to the cosmology with relation to the beings themselves? Is this something that has been looked at or has been considered?
Say that again. You're talking about how that energy affects human beings?
Well, if like for instance, if that energy is also supposed to relate to
the non-material material.
Well, and again, if there was some type of line of instruction or with relation to these, at least the knowledge that was passed on, is there any point in time where they had tried to communicate what these beings had looked like or taken manifestation of form for, if that had ever actually happened, if it were even possible?
Well, in the Buddhist conception of things, their most sacred symbols are understood to have been gifted to humanity by a non-human source. Now, the Dogon preserve a symbolic tradition that's a very close match for the Buddhist tradition, only preserved in an entirely different language, so that it's pretty clear that they were preserved independently of each other, not adopted in some recent era, one from the other. The Dogon say that their most sacred symbols were gifted to them by a non-human source, but they take it an additional step. They say that that source was originally non-material. Now, the quality of that connection, that instructional connection between a source that was originally non-material and the Dogon, is explained very clearly by them. And it's the same sort of situation that you see with Moses and the Israelites on the mountain. That the Israelites were cautioned very strongly to keep back from the mountain because of bad effects that might accrue to them from what was transpiring on the mountain itself. So very clearly in the Moses situation, if you believe that storyline, reflected actual events that were transpiring in a material frame, not communication simply from a non-material frame. This is not shamanic instruction. There's something that occurring on that mountain that potentially is going to impact those Israelites. This is physical stuff. The Dogon descriptions work the same way, that their teachers were concerned about the potential bad effects on us of being around them, and so they limited that. The way they limited it was they chose to instruct 8 members of each tribal group at a time and send those 8 back to instruct everybody else. Now the exposure was just to a small group, not to the large group. To me, this implies action in a material frame. The Dogon insists that it came originally from the non-material, and there's this perspective based on these this scrolling energy between non-material and material universes where that could be true.
Now, I do have one more question and actually I think this one's coming from Cosmodub, and I'm just going to ask you this one so that we have it when we go to break. And I'm also just going to make sure, because I know there's probably a possibility that I may have missed some. Oh, there's also one from Edward. At least we're going to get into a little bit of Egypt after the break. And Laird, new feature. We take a 10-minute, just chill out, listen to some. Everyone gets to listen to some music, and if they need to take care of some business, as it were, they have the chance to be able to do that. It's much more relaxing after a 2 or 3 hour show, I can tell you that. And this one's coming from Cosmodub, and he is asking, is the pyramid being 8-sided subtly? Or I should say, it is 8 subtly sided. How does this affect the symbolism or the symbology? And you don't have to answer right now. Everyone, we're going to be back right after the break. And this will be let me just double check here. No, Tyson, don't whine at me. It's just like, are you going on break yet, buddy? It's also a break for him. There we go. And we are going to be back. And I think we're back. Did I make it on time? Can you hear me now, Laird? Is there any music playing?
Can't hear anything.
Oh, okay. Wait. And we're back now. How's that? Is that better, Laird?
Not hearing you.
Not hearing me at all. Okay, this is weird. Um, okay. Give me a quick. Give me a second. Oh, now you can probably hear me.
Yep, now I can.
Okay, awesome. What was actually happening was Laird was able to hear the music from Spreaker. That's recording now in audio, which I'd routed through somehow to him, but I somehow can't connect the audio from OBS to Spreaker without a lot of finagling. So technology is grand. And again, thank you very much, everyone, for rejoining us here on the program in the Den of Lore, episode 96, slowly creeping towards episode 100 of the second hottest ancient mystery and occult / paranormal show of its kind on the planet. I don't know, we reach about 140 countries worldwide every single week. Not as many as the symbolism that we're talking about, because it reaches everywhere in very small ways. And a lot of it happens to be related to observations with the Earth and the world around them. And before we went on break, I'd asked Laird a very important question, and this one was from CosmoDub. Is the evidence suggests that the pyramid is subtly eight-sided, and how does that affect the symbology or symbolism behind it?
Okay, the best way to understand this is through a book of a friend of mine. Ed Nightingale has a book called The Giza Template.
Mm-hmm.
But to summarize the concept for you, we'll do this by metaphor. If you're familiar with music and musical notes, you understand that musical notes represent frequencies, that there's a mathematical relationship between them, and that if you were to strictly calculate the correct frequencies for each progressive musical note in the scale, and then try to tune an instrument to that and play it, it wouldn't sound quite right to you. There's a difference between frequency and tone, and to be right to the sound of the ear, the tone has to be a little bit fudged from what the actual frequency is. Now, that fudge factor happens to be the same factor as the difference, the ratio between, okay, the Great Pyramids, the sides of the Great Pyramids are subtly indented. If in the right light, you can see that it's a very subtle V shape, not a flat side, that with the center of the V and the center of the side. And that the difference in length that you would measure by measuring the V as opposed to measuring straight across the side of the pyramid is that ratio of that fudge factor. Now, so Ed, when he's deriving numbers based on structures on the Giza Plateau, will first derive what's called a root. He calls a root number. He derives a root speed of light and then applies that fudge factor and comes up with the actual speed of light. Every value that's expressed cosmologically at the Giza Plateau for him is represented this way, and many of the values are represented in multiple units of measure, so we have cross confirmation of meaning as to what the intention was for these values. You get it in cubits, you get it in feet, you get it in meters, and he's cataloged a lot of that. So from my way of understanding, that's what the purpose of the subtle indentation of the sides is about. It's about being able to represent the difference between what you would calculate mathematically and then what, as opposed to what you would actually experience.
And just a follow-up question, I think which may relate to it or it may not, but you never know. The Dogon mask refers to the Great Pyramid as the House of Ka, where Osiris is present to proceed into the Duat. Is there a relation? That one's from Abraham as well. Is there a relation to that, to the same idea of the mask that had been seen by that we'd seen from the Maori? And is there an indication from that could be explained besides the coronal mass ejection imagery in the atmosphere?
That's a complicated question. In the case of the Dogon, we have an explicit statement on the part of the priest as to what the symbol represents for them. And that definition that the modern priest is giving us is supported by the phonetics of the word, of the name of the mask. In other words, we have cross confirmation between what they remember it representing and what the name of it says it must represent based on the phonetics of cosmology. So the Dogon clearly, the intention of what the Dogon think it represents is clearly a sound statement. Now, as I said, because every aspect, every dynamic of this process of creation plays out on multiple scales, and also in relation to three themes. There's the theme of how matter forms, how the universe forms, and how biological reproduction happens. Those themes are so fundamentally similar to each other that the Dogon simultaneously represent all three themes using one progression of symbols. And so if you have a symbol like a hemisphere, that if we're talking about matter represents the concept of mass or matter. If we're talking about biological reproduction, it represents the expanded womb of a mother. So when we ask what is the meaning of a symbol, we can't really, it's not really fair to just ask that. We have to really ask what is the meaning of that symbol in a particular context. In relation to biology, what does it represent? In relation to quantum physics, what does it represent? In relation to universes, what does it represent? So that means there's wiggle room for the same symbol to have subtle shades of meaning that are different depending on the circumstance. My work requires that a culture flatly state what they think the symbolism of a figure is before I can adopt that as an interpretation. It may resemble certain things to me, but unless I have a culture that sees it that way, that's not a real interpretation from my point of view. That protects me from my own wishfulness.
And obviously, with this field, there can be a lot of interesting interpretations out there that can be seen, and having consistency and trying to get to the core root of a subject matter, it can be very difficult if you have every single idea that can be either interpreted or completely disregarded if you're not looking at the overall concept that's being perceived by the culture itself.
Right. So my first question always is, when someone proposes an interpretation, my first question always is, which culture sees it that way? And if they don't have a culture that sees it that way, then from my point of view, it's not a real interpretation yet. It doesn't become anchored until you can point to somebody who understood it that way. And that's what comparative cosmology is about. It's comparing how cultures A, B, C, and D all understood the same symbol. And from that, helping to triangulate it on an original meaning.
And for that particular symbol, if it's very similar to what has been seen in petroglyphs, let's explore the at least the mask as far as its concept is concerned. What other cultures have you seen that have used that symbol, and does it represent the same thing, or are there subtle changes or differences?
But sure, the Hopi Indians use the same symbol. Gary David actually has done some fairly extensive research about how they use that symbol. There are a lot of overlap between the Hopi and the Dogon in terms of rituals, ritual dances, ritual masks, things like that. To my understanding, the Hopi understanding of it is in the ballpark of what the Dogon understanding is, but I'm not, by the way, conversant in the Hopi side of it. But the Masonic people understand the symbol in exactly the same way that the Dogon do, which is actually a fairly good recommendation. If you can get the Kabbalists and the Dogon to agree on something, you're probably in the ballpark of what it means. If you can get the Masonics and the Dogon to agree on something, you're probably in the ballpark of what it means.
If you can get the Masonics to agree on anything.
That's not to say that this might not be an energetic form that someone can see. And many interpretations begin with someone noticing a resemblance between one thing and another thing. But you still have to anchor that. You still have to bring that down, find some way to identify a culture that understood the shape that way. And so that's always the trick.
With the Egyptians possibly having a line of connection and communication with Scarab Ray, and some possible culture having a line of connection at Göbekli Tepe. And obviously we've seen similar symbols within that part of the world in Göbekli Tepe, as we've seen in Australia, as we've seen in Easter Island. And the question is, if they had arrived at that island 1100, where is the place of instruction, and has it been found?
The Maori myths point to a place of instruction far to the east. They came by canoe over the ocean to New Zealand, presumably through a series of stages. Now, there are numerous symbolic elements to link traditions in the UK to traditions in New Zealand. That there's a pygmy tradition in New Zealand that expresses itself very much the same way as the pygmy tradition in Scotland and Ireland, the little people tradition. There are architectural forms that tie. There is language that ties. From the perspective of Ireland, when those little people were ostensibly kicked out of Ireland, they left by one myth to travel across the Western Sea, and by another myth, they went to the underworld. Well, as it turns out, an ancient name for New Zealand is interpreted by Edward Tregear as referring to the first circle of the underworld. So the Maori view of things is actually the mirror image of the Irish view of things. The name for this mythical place of instruction is, for the Maori, is Arukiwa. On Orkney, one of the ancient names that associates with Orkney in the traditions that I study is Aru. So we have that piece of the word right. The first sanctuary that was known on Orkney was a church situated in a city called Kirkwall, which was originally called Kirwa. So we have phonetic connection to the place. We have Maori schools that traditionally were teaching the very same set of subjects that are indicated as having been taught on Orkney Island. We're teaching agriculture, we're teaching cosmology, we're teaching astronomy, we're teaching stonemasonry, a whole set of things that go hand in hand. The title of the priestly initiates for the Maori can also mean firstborn. Now, when we understand that, if we see a connection to ancient Egypt, suddenly the idea of the slaying of the firstborn takes on a new meaning. That the slaying of the firstborn could have been an action that was targeted against the priests. So we have lots of different things to point to the Maori tradition coming out of the same Orkney Island instructional site that I connect to Egypt. They've done DNA studies on Orkney, expecting to find DNA that was primarily connected to the Celts and to Scandinavia. But in fact, they discovered that Orkney is one of the most genetically diverse places in the world for reasons they can't explain, with 1% of native Orkney men having markers for North Africa and Egypt. So there's lots of ways to connect the traditions.
What about the architecture? Obviously, the concept of the stupa with the Dogon is a recurring theme in a lot of places. Tibet is most notable from your work. What have you seen from that respect?
The Maori are not traditionally understood to have built permanent sanctuaries or shrines. They would mark sacred places with stones. Small stones, not the large megalithic standing stones that we would expect to see in places like Göbekli Tepe. So we have a lack of comparability between the Maori and the other cultures I study in terms of the types of shrines they build. But in terms of other cultures, we have fundamental comparability. There's a cosmologically based plan for a house on Orkney Island that is a match for a traditional Dogon stone house and is a match for burial chambers in Egypt that were understood to represent houses at the same era. So we have a basis of comparability there. The Maori, there are examples of stone cairns among the Maori, and stone cairns, which are, you see three stones set against each other with a flat stone on top. That's an early stupa form from my perspective. It's one of the forms that ties to the Göbekli Tepe region. The Dogon build them. It's one of the signatures of the tradition.
And are there any messages that at least that has been seen, if they haven't actually had the instruction site that's been found, are there any symbols or messages that are being used today or have been used within the recent past that were discovered to either indicate their origin or indicate um, uh, just trying to find the proper word here, that they were basically sent information to say, hey, we've been here before, we're going to be coming again, or hey, this is the last time we're coming.
This gets down to the rationale of the tradition itself, the motivation for an esoteric tradition in the first place, and the justification for it is book length. This is part of the reason I stepped up to self-publish the book Seeking the Primordial, because the material I felt needed to be out there, but you need an entire book's worth to be able to justify the perspective. The basic perspective, to try to summarize it without justification, is that we have this cycle of scrolling energy between universes that causes humanity to become progressively less aware of things non-material. Now, at the same time, okay, this scrolling of energy is not just energy, it's also scrolling of mass. And when a thing becomes more massive, its perception of time slows down. When a thing becomes less massive, its time frame, its relative time frame speeds up. This is Einstein's theory of relativity stuff. So at the same point in the Yuga cycle, if we're thinking about a great year or Yuga cycle, that the material side is its farthest removed from being able to perceive the non-material. The non-material is persisting. It has so little mass that's persisting in a time frame that runs ultra quickly, so quickly that they have no coherent moment in which to do anything. So effectively, the non-material consciousness is a locked-in consciousness. It's an awareness that has no ability to act. In a person, that's called locked-in syndrome. And it's a horrific state. It's like being buried alive unless you have someone who knows that you're there and can act on your behalf or communicate with you. There was a case in France, a gentleman who suffered locked-in syndrome. He had a stroke at the wheel of a car and then a car accident, and they thought he was brain dead. But in fact, he was perfectly conscious inside, just nobody knew it. He was able to blink his eyes, and after a period of time was able to communicate to one of his caretakers that he was actually in there, and she worked up a system with him to indicate letters one at a time by blinking. And he ended up writing an entire book one letter at a time. Well, the motivation for the esoteric tradition, from my point of view, is precisely that partway into the ascending cycle on the non-material side, the cycle that makes the universe less material, it figures it out that the trend is towards this locked-in condition. It understands that if it's not going to be simply buried alive for thousands of years, it needs to have a compatriot it can rely on. And so it establishes a framework for society on the material side to try to preserve the memory of the existence of the non-material side during the eras when we can't perceive it. And the structure of that esoteric tradition is such that not only does it mimic the dynamic between the non-material and the material universes itself, but it also has the effect of filtering out sincere, attentive caretakers. So it's as if the esoteric tradition is auditioning a babysitter or a nurse or a caretaker or an attendant. And so in the era that we're in right now, there are indicators that even though the traditional view of the Yuga cycle is that we have passed the bottommost point and are now on the ascending way back up, there are other reasons to think that we have just now reached the bottom of the cycle, that we've just passed the lowest point in the cycle. We're just now starting the ascent back up. And that only some of us are attentive to things non-material. Others of us, effectively, it doesn't exist.
So why would they need to be able to teach this to the Maori, or when the Dogon are still in Africa with this knowledge?
Well, at the time the system was set up at 10,000 BC, if you understand that the system's based on science and that people at 10,000 BC didn't have a great understanding of science or a technological capability to confirm it, the cosmology had to have been aimed at, targeted at a future audience thousands of years down the line that would have the technology. For the Buddhists, the most sacred symbols, their meaning inheres in their shape. These symbols are called adequate symbols, and they can't lose their meaning because it's a shape you can observe in nature if you have the right technology. But these are all microscopic shapes. It's like the shape of an electron orbit, or the shape of angular momentum. These are the shapes you can't readily view. So the task for someone trying to develop a symbolic system like this is, how do you figure out which metaphors and references and teaching techniques are going to actually work and resonate with the future audience, and which ones aren't? And how do you know which cultures it's going to resonate with and which ones it's not? And so the same system was presented in sort of regionally tailored formats to cultures all over the world, I think with the hope that at least one of them would retain the sense of meaning for the system and understand at the end of the cycle where we're at right now that it points to the presence of a non-material consciousness. Now, that consciousness in the archaic philosophy is not a deified consciousness, it's just a consciousness. As a matter of fact, the final stage of ascension in esoteric Buddhism is a visceral understanding that it's all the same consciousness. All the way up and down the scale, it's all the same consciousness.
Wow. Which could possibly be a pointer towards, and I forget the name of the effect. It's that same effect that people on the other side of the world can either think of the same thing, or think of a person, and that person will then call, and they could be on another continent, or like my father, whom one time we went for dinner. Our dog was with us, and they didn't have a dog bed. And all of a sudden, my dad shows up 25 minutes later from work. He'd just gotten off work, and he doesn't answer his cell phone until he hits the car. And when he drives, he doesn't pick it up. And he walks in the door. He's got a dog bed with him. And we're sitting there going, like, are you kidding me? And my parents have had this ability to do this for quite a long time. And I'm not sure if it just comes down to, once you've been married for 45 years, it looks like telepathy. But this same concept can be seen in dogs with their owners. Dog Tyson, apparently, my wife has said he's done this before, where I could be out of the house and I could be gone for 7 or 8 hours, and he won't know what time I'm coming home. I could be coming home at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. I could be coming home at 10, and he'll stay where he is with my wife until about half an hour before I show up, and he'll just get up and just walk to the, he'll sit down, he'll wait for me.
Well, this is like the cat in the hospital in England or whoever it was who would cozy up to patients who are about to die.
That's just because that cat was an asshole.
Or a murderer.
Either way. Like, how are you doing? Oh, well, I've been battling this illness for a long time, and how long? The doctor says I'm going to make a recovery. They just zooms in on the cat. Dun, dun.
Well, part of what the esoteric tradition is training initiates to be able to distinguish between synchronicities that have meaning and synchronicities that are just coincidences. And there are ways of distinguishing, but it takes some practice and it takes some skill. But there are tangible differences, and a person should be able to represent in a tangible way why this looks like it's a meaningful circumstance, not just a coincidental one. And both are said to exist. I mean, something can happen by accident.
Well, there are certain people who will say, like, when it comes to the world, there is no accidents. Everything's determined by fate in the stars. And there's others that will state that it's every single thing that happens is a consequence of the action from the last one, or consequences that were made before. So even then, you still don't know what's going to happen unless you just have that kind of a critical, analytical mind with regards to processes. But with long form communication or long distance communication between individuals or between beings, it would lead towards that idea of a shared, like not just a higher consciousness, but a shared consciousness, even if it's not necessarily perceived. And
Right.
my question would be the implication to what this would mean to our species as a whole if this is something that's actually true.
Right.
Because, well,
And I don't have anything to say that it couldn't be true. Um, the first thing a person in my field of study learns is that there's stuff going on that we can't explain yet, that we're not in a position yet to explain. As a matter of fact, the lion's share of references that I would come across during the early, especially during the early years of my study, fell into the category of things that I couldn't state positively whether it was truthful or not. And it's only over time that you get enough of a perspective on things to be able to make an argument for why a certain thing needs to be seen a certain way.
and what about the areas of the Pacific where this information can also be found? Obviously, Easter Island would be an easy one that most people may consider as the naval form for the statues on Easter Island match the designs as we found on in Göbekli Tepe. And
Right.
obviously, this has a certain connotation to it, so it would lead some people to believe that there is a connection to them. And obviously, if you're considering the Polynesian people,
Right. Well, if the Polynesian language
mhm,
is formulated on these phonetics, then any culture that speaks Polynesian languages is a potential candidate. They likely were influenced. That those phonetics are a signature of the tradition. Just like any culture
mhm.
that practices circumcision or uses a cubit is probably not probably they, to my point of view, they were clearly influenced by the same tradition.
And what about Easter Island as being a possible place of instruction? Is this something that has been looked into or considered?
I don't know of a group that says that that's true, and I haven't studied it closely enough to know if it could be true. Um, the thing on Orkney Island is the megalithic structures there are set out like an alphabet for matter. That if you went to a place like Easter Island and you saw carved in giant stone figures recognizable letters of the English alphabet, even if they weren't all there, but they were in sequence, it wouldn't take a brain surgeon to figure out they were trying to represent the alphabet. Well, the same thing is true on Orkney. When I started paying attention to what the sequence of those megalithic sites were and what their shapes were, it's a recognizable sequence to me. It's the alphabet of matter spelled out in stone. Now,
Hmm.
it's hard to imagine that that was anything but instructional.
I'm trying to be able to formulate because as I always get the comment, and I think it was my brother who was sitting here, just listening in for the first half of the show, and he asked me like, "Dude, do you like plan the shows out?" I'm like, "No, because if I do that, I can't ask the really cool questions if they come up." And I'm like the concept of the Maori is it's a people that a lot of people know, and they know from the haka dance, from rugby, and that being a way to really intimidate the hell out of your opposing team.
Yes.
And like, there's one thing for people to stand and teams will, get ready for a match, and you're trying to game each other out, and you play the, like, man, what you saying? And no, like these guys just get into a line and they do a massive dance, which is essentially telling their team, we are going to kill you and kill you badly, and then we're going to wear your head like a hat around if necessary, as a message to everyone else to not screw with us. So, and if anybody knows anything about rugby or Australian rules football, and especially rugby, um, the All Blacks are one of the roughest teams to ever play because they play harder than pretty well anyone anywhere else. What about the haka dance? Is this something that is worked into your book as the symbolism?
No, actually, it's not, and I haven't compared the dance rituals of the Maori with dance rituals of places like the Dogon. Um, Pretty much every aspect of these cultures that have done a good job, a careful job of preserving the cosmological tradition, have symbolism to them, or originally had symbolism to them. So if you dug deeply enough, you surely would find it with the Maori. Um, the Maori, it's very interesting. You see connections to Christianity. You see Book of Genesis stuff with the Maori. But interestingly, you also see references that filter down to Christianity at Göbekli Tepe, or potentially filter down. Language suggests that it does. So it's a mixing and matching of ideas. Part of what I do with the book is try to demonstrate how Maori culture ties to each of these other traditions. The Göbekli Tepe tradition at 10,000 BC, the Shakti Cult tradition in between, the ancient Egyptian culture, the Dogon, the Orkney cultures, even references to ancient China and Tibet, places like that. It's all the same tradition with different aspects preserved in different regions, different locales. That's another really interesting part of these studies is you never know what looks like a loose end in one culture is preserved in much better form in another culture. So you never know when you start studying a new culture what you might turn up. Something you thought was insignificant might turn out to have significance.
Well, for instance, Abraham's stating, it's like, well, isn't that body posture of the Haka link look very similar to the symbol of the Dogon and the Mask of Ka, which is very interesting because part of it, at least, it was stated in the chat room that, well, they would take that form and then you have your hand motions, but you do have that same position or that same posture. Not having looked into the dance, it is. Something to look into, ladies and gentlemen. I'd say do your research and come to your conclusion.
There are so many subtle areas of potential research here, little niches that someone who had an interest could look into. I came into this thinking that, well, surely there aren't any questions left to be explored that somebody hasn't already beaten to death. But in fact, very often, even when someone has an opinion about a subject, they haven't really pursued it down to the core of its beginning. And when you do that, oftentimes you understand things in a different way than you did when you started out.
And what other cultures have discussed the Maori that have, if we've traced their origins all the way back to possibly to India and the possible cosmology there, and then again back through the Levant and on way to Orkney, how have the tales or the legends within the region follow them? Is this something that you've also looked at, or have you?
Sure. I mean, there's okay. You remember at Göbekli Tepe we have 3 symbols that look like handbags.
Oh, it's the handbags
on one of the pillars there. It's a circular hemispheric top with a squared bottom. Takes the shape of what looks to us like a handbag.
Mm-hmm.
But from my perspective, what you have at Göbekli Tepe are recurring various methods of restating that this is a sanctuary or a temple. In ancient times, I had said that a circle is symbolic of the non-material and a square is symbolic of the material. If you reconcile those two shapes, it becomes a symbol for a sanctuary where the non-material and the material come together.
Mm-hmm.
So that handbag or basket shape that reconciles a circular shape with a squared shape is an early attempt at reconciling, at basically squaring a circle. It's a method of squaring the circle. The Dogon cosmology is called, by some people, sometimes referred to as the basket cosmology. Well, in Maori tradition, there's a departmental god named Tain, who in one of the myths ascends to the gods and returns with 3 baskets of knowledge. So you have those kinds of references that potentially tie, where the Maori are suddenly understanding their cosmology in terms of baskets, just like the other traditions do, more specifically in terms of 3 baskets. In Iraq, an early form of a temple called a chaitya was characterized by 3 domes, the 3 dome shapes. In ancient Egypt, an early portable shrine called a seh was shaped just like those handbag shapes.
Huh. And I know that we've all looked at the handbags and wondered what they are. And I know individuals and researchers such as Graham Hancock have offered their potential interpretations of what they possibly could be, and he has even speculated that they could have a relation to ayahuasca bags. And it would just lead me to believe with what you've just told me, or at least not lead me to believe. I'll rephrase that. The first thought that comes to mind is, okay, he came back with 3 bags, so it's like, hey man, we just got this really great stuff. Let's expand our knowledge, and they just have a really good time for a couple hundred years. So
Yes.
I'm
No, that's all possible. Also, there's no reason why these symbolic shapes couldn't also take actual forms of actual objects in the culture. That's one of the ways that knowledge was reinforced mnemonically was through objects of daily life.
And how else would that be translated into the reconciling of the circle? Has there anything been found with the Maori that has related to that besides just that handbag symbol, or is that it?
That's very hard to say because there's so many ways of doing this. The traditional shape of a Maori school is laid out like a hemisphere. It's a horseshoe-shaped stone structure.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, the most frequently found archaeological form in Ireland is precisely that shape. In Ireland, they have no idea what it represents. For the Maori, it's a village school. Every village has one. So there are connections through those concepts between Ireland and New Zealand, even through language that helps to confirm that these structures in Ireland might have represented village schools.
Now, one aspect of the squaring of the circle, or the reconciling of the circle, is an interesting, and I actually have this here. This was brought forward by Randall Carlson in one of his videos, and I'll see if I can bring this up here for you and for all of you at home. And this is one way you can square the circle, which is by using the relation of the shape of the moon and the shape of the Earth, and that actually does square the circle, which it blew my mind when I found this out. And the standard, okay, we've got a circle in there, then you've got a square where it's just the corners that are cut off. And this type of design can be seen through, let's say, the pyramids, or through places such as Stonehenge, I believe, is also being looked at here. For this type of symbolism to be used, this is more of the well-known one. And obviously, this shape could have been changed over time. What do you think what are they trying to say beyond just, okay, well, this is a meeting place, or this is a place of instruction? If it either hasn't been found, or if there are specific areas that have been, because the schools are shaped like this, but...
Well, one of the things that was being taught at these schools was astronomy. And astronomical instruction obviously happened at night. So the placement of the stones might either have facilitated that instruction the same way a stone circle could, or might actually have represented exercises that were preliminary to being able to build such a thing as a stone circle, or a Stonehenge type site for astronomic viewing. So it could be a connection that way. Without some culture flatly explaining to us why they do it. If the Maori could tell us flatly why they did it, we'd have a basis for forming an opinion. Everything else is sort of speculation.
One thing we haven't talked about is in a long time, and I think we may have touched on it in our first interview almost a year ago, year and a half ago, which is Chinese symbolism, which I don't think it gets talked about very much, as everyone's on the whole Göbekli Tepe tip, as it were. Try and say that 3 times fast, people. How they're so close to one another compared to India, or to Sri Lanka, or to even the Levant. How have you seen similarities in Chinese cosmology?
Well, the Chinese cosmology is fundamentally similar. We can demonstrate it's fundamentally similar to the other cosmologies I've worked with. We have direct comparability between the earliest Chinese hieroglyphic words and Egyptian hieroglyphic words, formulated in precisely the same way to express the same meaning for certain words.
Mm.
We have the first two Chinese deities. Nu Wa was the mother goddess, and Fu Xi was the creator god. In the earliest representation they have in China of those two deities, she's holding a compass to measure the circularity of the heavens, and he's holding a carpenter's square to measure the squareness of the earth. This is the exact same symbolism we're talking about. There's a long list of what I call signatures of the tradition, where if you see a culture using this reference, it's almost certain that they were influenced by the cosmological tradition. Any culture that imagines a wheel or a chariot associated with Orion is automatically, in my book, connected to the tradition. I would know to expect to find references that would tie. This is why with the Maori, when I realized their concept of the Po was a match for the Dogon concept of the Po, it was almost no risk for me to start exploring the Maori. It was a foregone conclusion there was going to be a connection. And China's the same way. The ancient plan for agriculture in China, which is treated in China as if it were theoretical, is the same plan that was actually implemented for the Dogon. It's called the Wellfield Plan. The difficulty in China is that events that transpired around 3000 BC or before, let's say before 1700 BC, weren't written down until around, or our knowledge of them comes out of texts that were written down around 300 BC. So we have this huge gap of thousands of years between when the thing happened and when somebody wrote about it. And so there's all this wiggle room for academics to be debating about what did they really mean by this. And it's only when you put it in the context of the other cultures who do the same things that you can firmly say, this represents this.
And how about the period around 709 BC? Cosmo's asking this, and I think this is actually a really good question, because if we're looking at 709 BC, and obviously the concept around that being that it is the first time when we can pinpoint a solar eclipse being recorded that then proceeds on to today and it being accurate and correct. And before that, there are discrepancies with the measurements. So the main reason is that, well, something had changed at that point. And is there any point in time where, and my follow-up to that would be, is there any point in time where the Maori had recorded that or tried to communicate that discrepancy?
The Maori tradition, from my point of view, is too late to be able to be expected to have references that early, or to be able to trust references. They have no way of estimating time frames. They know that they know that something happened in mythological times for themselves, but they don't have a way of quantifying when. So that's a difficulty. At 709 BC, we have lots of really interesting things that happened. We have a major fluctuation in the magnetic field that nobody can explain. It's a major period of volcanic activity for no apparent reason. It was followed by major climate change, so that plants that had been traditionally cultivated in China for thousands of years suddenly couldn't be grown there anymore. Mm-hmm. We have a change in the absorption rate of ions, radiometric absorption rate of ions in plants, so that radiometric dating has a problem across that boundary. And we have the circumstance that every total eclipse of the sun since 709 BC has been verified to the place and the date through simple math. I mean, computer programs can do it. The motions of the Earth and the Moon and the Sun should be like clockwork. And if they are, then we should be able to retrospectively calculate all these eclipses. But when you pass the boundary of 709 BC, suddenly you can't. You have 40-some reported total eclipses in China alone that nobody has been able to verify. They can only at best come close. Now, the problem is that the same guy who's reporting the eclipse is the one historians are hanging their hats on in terms of establishing historical timelines. So it's not like the guy's not credible. This is a credible observer who's reporting the eclipse, and the astronomers can't confirm it. And the best they can come up with was, well, maybe it was foggy that morning, or maybe this guy wasn't really a reliable observer, or whatever they can come up with.
And now we've got about 10 minutes left on the main broadcast. And again, Laird, you're more than welcome to join us for the post show if you're up for taking a phone call or two, which I think lasts about half an hour. I'm getting messages saying, it's like, let me know when the podcast is done. So I won't keep you too much longer. If you're up to it, let me know. If not, well, we can always leave that as a hint, or as a lead for everyone else to come and join us the next time we come in.
I'm happy to hang around for a few questions.
Fantastic. This regards to the Tomoko tattoos, which are obviously one of the defining features of the Maori and some Polynesian people in particular. They seem to be very purposeful with how they are designed and where they're placed. What has your research has been able to uncover regarding these, if anything?
Well, this is a tradition that doesn't have a correlate in the other cultures that I'm dealing with. But part of the problem is that tattooing is something that, for the most part, except in very rare instances, we don't have any indication of whether a body was tattooed that's 3,000 years or 5,000 years old. If it comes out from 3,000 or 2,000 BC, the remains are too deteriorated to be able to know if it had been tattooed. So there might well have been a tattooing tradition in some of these ancient cultures that we don't know about that had significance that would go along with the Maori. But because we don't have other cultures to compare, all the other cultures I'm studying are so much older than the Maori that there's an impasse there. I don't have a basis of comparison. And so I could take what the Maori say at face value, or but I wouldn't have any way of anchoring that. I would just say this is the opinion of priests among the Maori as to why this particular tattoo means this particular thing. Other less tangible forms, it's easy to correlate. There's a concept of tapu, which is, if you remember from your Tarzan movies, the concept of taboo, the religious transgression that causes the supposedly uneducated tribes people to go into a panic. Tapu is a concept that has to do with basically symbolic purity or ritualistic purity. The Dogon have the concept. We see the concept of it in Egypt. We see it among the Maori. It's an acquired state. It comes from transgressions, basically. Even in modern Judaism, you see it. That in modern Judaism, if there's a burial at a cemetery, when the people at the burial retire to the house for a reception afterwards, they always wash their hands before they go into the house. A pitcher of water is left out for them to ritually cleanse their hands before they step into the house. This is a spiritual cleansing of a tapu.
Okay.
So that kind of thing that can't deteriorate over time, we're able to form a basis of comparison with, based on rituals, based on language, based on architectural forms, based on things like if they were built in stone and so forth. But anything that has to do with the state or condition of the body, I mean, even the question of pygmies is highly controversial in New Zealand and in the UK of short-statured people. You have many circumstances on Orkney where somebody who's not medically qualified comes across a skeleton that's so small that they presume it must be the skeleton of a child. And then it's supposedly sent off for testing, and you never hear confirmation back about whether it was officially determined to be the skeleton of a child or not. You had a recent one where it was cited as the first case of rickets in the UK. It's a vitamin D deficiency. They're presuming that the reason this body was so short-statured was because a guy who spent all of his time out in the sunlight had developed rickets, a vitamin D deficiency. Now, again, the body was sent off for testing. I can't find any reference to results as a result of that testing. So there's never a clear statement, well, yes, it really did turn out to be that. Or is it possible that somebody stumbled across a short-statured person that goes along with these controversial traditions?
And so it's a possibility it could have been picked up from just another culture as they went along, and not necessarily related directly to their, at least into the instruction, which
It could, might be or might not be, and I don't have a basis for knowing without finding another culture, a living culture that still does it and understands why they do it. Or if they even have a proper term for it, the language can often point me to what the intention was. But in the absence of that, I don't have anything to work on.
And speaking of not having anything to work on, it's very rarely that you're not working on something. And what new projects, what exciting things do I have to look forward to?
Well, as it turns out, from my perspective and from the Dogon perspective and the perspective of the Samkhya philosophy, which is the ancient cosmology, the archaic cosmology, the dynamics of how matter forms, of how creation happens, are pretty simple. There's a handful of dynamics that play out in parallel form all the way up the scale. Very simple ones. And they basically have to do with the fact that when two energetic streams come together, they tend to spin. And spinning creates what's called angular momentum. Mm-hmm. And many of the key Dogon symbols that represent core concepts of creation represent facets of angular momentum. This is one of the keys to how energy of matter, energy materializes as matter, even in the scientific view. So that a lot of my focus of attention has been on trying to understand both how those dynamics, what are the stages of those dynamics are, and trying to correlate those to the ancient deities that were meant to represent them, because the attributes of the deities give me some more insight into the dynamics. And so I've been spending a lot of time working on that. My book project at the moment is a manuscript called The Plan of the Ancient Cosmology.
Ooh.
And I'm taking it as an opportunity to discuss from the perspective of whoever put this symbolic system together, what indications of intention we can see, what considerations you can observe. There's a certain effect that fascinates me, where you can see that there was an intended result, but the intended result was not carried out perfectly. You see this with the arms carved on the pillars of Göbekli Tepe. It took me a long time to understand that those were meant to represent the concept of a familial embrace, a warm familial embrace. But the way they're implemented on the pillars, that's the last thing you would guess artistically is what it is meant to represent. It doesn't convey any of the nuance of warmth that you would need to get that. And so those situations where there's an effort to do something, but it's done less than perfectly, shine some lights on the intentions and capabilities of whoever put the system together. And that happens at various stages along the way, where there's some inexplicable change that was made, and trying to understand why was it transferred from this idea to that idea. You can gain some insights into what the mindset was of whoever put the system together.
I can't wait for that one, and I can't wait for the ability to read it and then have you on again down the road. As is tradition, I will make sure that I ask you it a lot earlier on, and make sure that your schedule is can be fit in, and hopefully
I'll also try to give you some warning before I actually publish another book. Sometimes the time frames, a lot with publishers these days, lead times on books expand. Even for somebody like an Andrew Collins, there could be a year and a half wait from the time he submits a manuscript to the time the book's published.
Wow.
So,
well,
so sometimes it's a little iffy.
Well, at that time, I may actually have my daughter hanging around my neck at that point. We're just doing the show, and she's just like pulling on my arm. It's like, Dad, you done yet? Like, no, I want to talk to Laird. I want to ask him a question.
Yes. Well, some of the best questions come from the minds that have least the fewest preconceptions. So
when she asks you, it's like, Laird, did the ancient Dogon have feet? Then you'll know. Stick around, everyone. We're going to be spooling up the after show in about 10 minutes. So let's see. It's 10:20 right now. 10:30. We go live again. Patreon.com. Actually, to get the outro music on there. Patreon.com/Den of Lore, or you can hit me up at the denoflore.com/ I'll just go to denoflore.com, hit donate via PayPal, and I want to get the email. I will send you the link for the after show. We're going to take a few phone calls and discuss some of the information out there. I can't wait for next week. Next week, starting Monday, again, we didn't have enigmas and shit this Monday due to, well, there was I think it was a birthday or something in the family with Michael. We're going to be returning to that on Monday. And again, Crypto Corner, we had a great show this past week with Denver. And we're going to continue on, and we may be bringing back some information on giants, whom we're still working on the great book, Men of Renown. And this Man of Renown right here, I believe, is still tapped to write our intro, and I could not have asked for a better person to do it. So, from me to you, to everyone out there, thank you very much for listening in today. Have yourselves a wonderful weekend. Do not stay in the sun too long, and if you do, make sure you bring some aloe vera or use sunscreen. Stay safe, and we'll see you all next week.